This is the story of how a husband's twisted obsession led him to poison his wife, all so he could marry her daughter. Helen McMillan was a 48-year-old with big dreams and a loving family in Shaker Heights, Ohio. Helen was married to Frank McMillan, a man 16 years her junior. Despite the age difference, Helen and Frank appeared to be a happy couple. Frank worked for a health insurance company and was often busy with work, but the couple made time for each other. They had been married for 5 years and lived with Helen's daughter from a previous marriage, 19-year-old Lisa Levinsky McMillan. Lisa was a bright and ambitious college student to study in pre-med and had dreams of becoming a doctor. Helen was proud of her daughter and supported her in every way she could. In the weeks leading up to her death, Helen was planning a family vacation to Orlando. She was excited about the trip and talked about it constantly. She had recently purchased a new suitcase and was filling it with summer clothes, sunscreen, and a new pair of sandals. Helen loved spending time with her family and couldn't wait for the getaway, but Helen's excitement would forever be cut short when on the morning of April 17, 2019, she was found dead in her home. On the morning of April 17, 2019, Shaker Heights was just waking up. It was a cool, overcast day, typical of spring in Ohio. The neighborhood was quiet, with only a few early risers out walking their dogs or grabbing their morning coffee from Starbucks. Helen McMillan had always been an early bird, but that day something was wrong. At around 8:30 a.m., Lisa Levinsky McMillan, Helen's 19-year-old daughter, went downstairs to the kitchen. She found her mother lying on the floor, unresponsive. A can of Helen's favorite drink and America's as well. Diet Pepsi was spilled beside her, the sugary sweet liquid slowly seeping into the grout between the tiles. Panicked, Lisa screamed and immediately called 911, her hands shaking as she dialed. The dispatcher's voice tried to calm her down, but Lisa was too overwhelmed. She was crying and begging for someone to come quickly. When the paramedics arrived just minutes later, they found Lisa in shock. Pacing back and forth in the living room, the house was eerily quiet, except for the sound of the 911 call still echoing from Lisa's phone on the kitchen counter. The paramedics rushed to Helen's side, but it was too late. Helen was declared dead at the scene. Lisa couldn't believe what was happening. Just the day before, her mother had been excitedly talking about their upcoming vacation, picking out outfits and making plans. Now she was gone, and Lisa was left feeling lost and confused. As the paramedics worked, Lisa called her stepfather, Frank McMillan, who was at work at the time. Frank's reaction was hysterical. He immediately started wailing, almost screaming, as Lisa sobbed into the phone. He told her he would leave work right away, but he sounded almost insane with grief. The Shaker Heights Police Department was quick to respond to the scene at the McMillan residence. Detective Laura Robacek, who had been with the department for over 15 years, led the investigation. Robacek was known for her sharp eye and methodical approach. She had a reputation for solving even the most challenging cases. When she arrived at the scene on the morning of April 17, 2019, she immediately sensed something was off. The McMillan home was a typical well-kept suburban house with a neat lawn and flower bed starting to bloom with the first signs of spring. Inside, the house was clean and organized. The only sign of anything out of the ordinary was the sight of Helen McMillan's lifeless body on the kitchen floor. Next to her was a spilled can of Diet Pepsi, America's nostalgic drink favorite, its silky brown contents fooling around her. Detective Robacek and her team began their work by securing the crime scene. Yellow tape was quickly put up around the perimeter of the house, and officers were stationed at the entrance to keep onlookers and neighbors at a distance. The investigators carefully examined the kitchen. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing appeared to be out of place. Helen's purse was on the counter, untouched, and the back door was locked from the inside. The team noticed that the can of Diet Pepsi was still relatively full, with only a small amount spilled on the floor. This caught Robacek's attention. She instructed the crime scene unit to collect the can as evidence, along with the remaining liquid. The team also took samples from the kitchen counter and floor to test for any unusual substances. They photographed the scene from every angle, documenting every detail. An autopsy was ordered to determine the exact cause of Helen's death. The paramedics on the scene had suspected a heart attack, but Robacek wasn't so sure. There was something about the way Helen was positioned and the fact that she had been drinking her favorite soda, or pop as they call it in the Midwest, just moments before that made Robotchek suspicious. As the investigation continued, the detectives combed through the house for more clues. They searched Helen's personal belongings, looking for anything that might suggest foul play. Her phone was also taken as evidence. With the intention of checking her recent calls and messages, Detective Robotchek knew this case would require careful examination. There was much more to Helen's death than met the eye. With Helen McMillans' death under investigation, the police turned their attention to the people closest to her. The first person they questioned was her husband, Frank McMillan. At 32 years old, Frank was much younger than Helen. He worked for a health insurance company in Cleveland, and had a reputation for being handsome, charming, and successful. He seemed to have everything: a stable job, a nice home, and a wonderful family. But as detectives began to dig deeper, they uncovered a different side of Frank. Frank had met Helen 6 years earlier when he was working as a junior analyst at the insurance company. Helen, a widow at the time, had been charmed by his youthful energy and confidence. They married a year later, and Frank became a stepfather to Helen's daughter, Lisa, then 13. On the surface, their marriage seemed solid, but friends noticed that Frank had become more distant from Helen in the past year. He spent longer hours at work, often coming home late or claiming he had to travel for business. During his first interview with the police, Frank appeared calm, even cold. He expressed shock over Helen's death, but his emotions seemed muted. He told Detective Laura Robotchek that he had been at work when it happened and had rushed home as soon as Lisa called him. When asked about his relationship with Helen, Frank claimed that they had a good marriage, though he admitted they had grown apart over time. He insisted that he had nothing to do with her death and had no idea why anyone would want to harm her. However, as the interview continued, Detective Robotchek's suspicions grew. Frank was too composed, too controlled. When asked about Helen's plans, Frank was vague, saying he was a feminist and didn't like to keep track of his wife's day-to-day activities. He also couldn't recall the last time they had a meaningful conversation or had sex together as a couple. Robotchek found it odd that Frank, who claimed to love his wife, seemed so disconnected from her life. The detectives also noticed inconsistencies in Frank's statements. For instance, he mentioned that he knew about Helen's and America's favorite drink, Diet Pepsi. Yet he couldn't explain why there was a half-empty can next to her body when she was found. He claimed Helen drank soda often, but didn't seem to know much about her other habits or routines. As the police continued to question Frank, they began to consider his potential motive. Could Frank have wanted out of the marriage, or was there something else, something darker driving him? The investigation into Frank's life revealed that he had been keeping secrets. One of the most shocking was his sexual obsession with his stepdaughter, Lisa. This revelation gave the police a new angle to pursue if Frank was in love with Lisa. It could explain why he might want Helen out of the way, but proving that Frank was involved in Helen's death would require much more evidence. Detective Robotchek knew they had to be thorough, carefully piecing together the puzzle that was starting to form. The next person the police investigated was Lisa Levinsky McMillan, Helen's 19-year-old daughter from a previous marriage. Lisa was a bright and driven young woman who was well on her way to becoming a doctor. She was a pre-med student at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, where she had earned a scholarship for her academic excellence. Lisa was known for her kindness and dedication to her studies, often volunteering at local hospitals and tutoring fellow underprivileged students, a common pastime in Shaker Heights in her free time. Lisa had always looked up to her mother, seeing Helen as a role model of strength and compassion. The two were incredibly close, often spending weekends together, shopping, watching movies, or just talking about life snuggled in bed together. Helen had been Lisa's biggest supporter, especially after the death of Lisa's biological father when she was just a child. The loss had forged an incredibly strong bond between mother and daughter, making Helen's sudden death all of them were devastating for Lisa. When the police first approached Lisa, she was visibly distraught. The grief of losing her mother was compounded by the shock of finding her dead corpse. Lisa told the detectives that she had been studying for an upcoming biology exam when she decided to take a break and grab a snack. She went to the kitchen and found her mother on the floor, unresponsive, with a can of Diet Pepsi nearby. In a panic, Lisa called 911, hoping against hope that it wasn't too late. During the interview, Lisa was cooperative but deeply emotional. She described her mother's recent mood as happy and content, with no signs of stress or unhappiness. Lisa couldn't think of anyone who would want to harm Helen, describing her mother as someone who was loved by everyone who knew her. The police asked Lisa about her relationship with Frank, her stepfather, and Lisa spoke highly of him, saying that he was, quote, a hottie and that she saw him as a supportive father figure. She was completely unaware of his secret sexual obsession with her, a fact that made the police even more concerned and somewhat suspicious. As detectives delved deeper into Lisa's life, they found nothing to suggest she had any involvement in her mother's death. Her alibi checked out. Lisa had been in her room. Engrossed in her studies at the time of the murder, her social media activity showed a typical college student's life, with posts about school, friends, liberal political causes, and upcoming exams. There were no signs of any secret relationships or troubling behavior. However, the police were still suspicious of the dynamics within the McMillan household. They wondered if Lisa could have been an unknowing pawn in Frank's plan. If Frank's sexual obsession with Lisa was as intense as they suspected, it could mean that Lisa was in danger too. But for now, there was no evidence linking Lisa to the crime, leaving detectives to focus their attention elsewhere. The third person the police questioned was Jessica Miller, Helen's closest friend and confidant. Jessica, 45, was a real estate agent who had known Helen for over a decade. But two women had bonded over their shared experiences as working women in Shaker Heights and had become inseparable over the years. Jessica was often seen at Helen's home helping with community events or just sharing a glass of wine in the evenings. To those who knew them, their friendship seemed unbreakable, a bond built on trust and mutual respect. However, the police soon discovered that Jessica had been keeping a significant secret. Despite her outward loyalty to Helen, Jessica had been having an affair with Frank McMillan. This revelation came as a shock to everyone who knew the trio, especially given Jessica's deep friendship with Helen. According to Jessica, the affair began about a year before Helen's death. She claimed that it started innocently, with Frank coming alone to one of Jessica's infamous naked hot tub parties. A few flirtatious comments later, things quickly escalated into a full-blown sexual relationship. Jessica admitted to feeling, quote, a little bleeping guilty about betraying her friend, but said she couldn't resist Frank's, quote, smoking hot bod. When the police interviewed Jessica, she was nervous and defensive. She knew that her affair with Frank placed her under suspicion, but she insisted that she had nothing to do with Helen's death. Jessica claimed that she was kind of saddened by Helen's passing, and had even considered lowering the number of times she had sex per week with Frank because of the guilt she felt. However, she also revealed that Frank had recently told her he was in love with someone else and dumping, leaving her devastated. Jessica didn't know who the other woman was, but she suspected it might be someone younger, possibly Lisa. The detectives pressed Jessica for more details about her sexual relationship with Frank and her whereabouts on the day of Helen's death. Jessica stated that she had been at a real estate showing in Cleveland Heights and had clients who could verify her alibi. The police followed up on this, confirming that Jessica was indeed with clients at the time of the murder. However, they couldn't ignore the possibility that Jessica might have been involved in some way, given her emotional turmoil and jealousy over Frank's shifting affections. Despite her alibi, Jessica remained a person of interest in the investigation. Her affair with Frank, coupled with her close relationship with Helen, made her a complicated figure in the case. The police had to consider whether Jessica's jealousy and heartbreak might have driven her to do something drastic. But without concrete evidence linking her to the crime, Jessica was left in a precarious position, caught between her guilt over the affair and her sorrow over losing her friend. Hey, true crime case solvers interested in more real-life murder mysteries? Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. And do you have any thoughts about this case, or have a case of your own you'd like us to investigate? Leave us a comment. Stay safe. True crime case solvers. On April 27, 2019, just after 9 a.m., the weather in Shaker Heights was cool and overcast, typical for an Ohio spring. As investigators continued to search for clues, they received a significant break in the case. A toxicology report came back from the lab, revealing that Helen McMillan's cause of death was cyanide poisoning. The lethal substance had been mixed into her can of Diet Pepsi, confirming that her death was not a natural occurrence but a deliberate act of murder. The revelation of cyanide as the murder weapon shocked the investigation team. Cyanide is a rare and deadly poison, often associated with high-profile cases and espionage. The detectives knew they were dealing with a premeditated crime. Someone had gone to great lengths to plan and execute Helen's murder. This new evidence shifted the focus of the investigation. Giving the police a clearer direction, the detectives immediately revisited the crime scene, searching for any trace of the poison or how it might have been introduced into Helen's drink. They examined the Diet Pepsi can, the surrounding area in the kitchen, and any containers or objects that might have come into contact with the poison. Forensic experts were called in to analyze everything, from the remnants of the drink to the fingerprints on the can, while no direct trace of cyanide was found in the kitchen. The forensic team did find traces of the poison on the rim of the can, confirming that it had been deliberately laced with a deadly substance. The discovery raised more questions. Who had access to the poison, and how did they get it into Helen's drink without her noticing? The police began to dig into the backgrounds of all the suspects, searching for any history of chemical knowledge or access to dangerous substances. They'd also looked into recent purchases and online searches that might indicate someone had been researching or acquiring cyanide. The detectives knew that cyanide was not something easily obtained. Whoever had used it had likely done some serious planning. This new evidence also put pressure on the suspects. The police re-interviewed them, focusing on their knowledge of poisons and any suspicious behavior leading up to Helen's death. The detectives were determined to find out who had the means and motive to commit such a calculated crime, with the case now pointing definitively to murder. The investigation took on a new urgency as they closed in on the truth. On April 20, 2019, just before noon, the police made a breakthrough in the investigation that would lead them directly to the murderer. After carefully examining the evidence and re-interviewing the suspects, the detectives had begun to piece together a disturbing picture. All signs pointed to Frank McMillan, Helen's husband, as the one responsible for her death. Frank McMillan, 32, was a charming and successful man who worked at a health insurance company. Outwardly, he appeared to have it all: a stable job, a beautiful wife, and a picture-perfect life in the progressive utopia of Shaker Heights. However, beneath the surface, Frank was a man driven by dark and twisted sexual desires. He had become obsessed sexually with Helen's daughter and his stepdaughter, Lisa Levinsky McMillan, from her previous marriage. Frank had secretly harbored sexual feelings for Lisa, who was only 19 and completely unaware of his intentions. As his obsession grew, Frank became increasingly distant from Helen, seeing her as an obstacle to his disturbing fantasy of starting a new life with Lisa as his bride. Detectives uncovered key evidence that tied Frank to the crime. An analysis of his internet search history revealed that he had been researching cyanide for several months before Helen's death. He had searched for information on where to buy it, how to use it, and its effects on the human body. This damning evidence suggested that Frank had carefully planned the murder, intending to use cyanide to get rid of Helen without leaving a trace. On the day of the murder, Frank had taken advantage of Helen's daily routine. He knew that she loved Diet Pepsi and drank a can every day after work. According to the investigation, Frank had spiked her can of Diet Pepsi with cyanide, knowing that she would drink it as soon as she got home. The poison worked quickly, causing Helen to collapse and die within minutes. Frank's plan was to make it look like a sudden heart attack, but the toxicology report revealed the truth. The police confronted Frank with the evidence they had gathered. At first, he tried to maintain his innocence, but as the detectives laid out the facts, his internet searches, his growing obsession with Lisa, and the traces of cyanide on the can, Frank's facade began to crumble. Frank's arrest shocked the Shaker Heights community. Helen's friends and neighbors were horrified to learn that the man they had once thought of as a devoted husband had committed such a heinous act. Lisa was devastated by the revelation, struggling to come to terms with the fact that the man she had considered a father figure had been secretly plotting against her mother. The trial of Frank McMillan began on January 15, 2019, in Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Court. The case drew significant media attention, with local news channels covering the proceedings extensively. Helen McMillan's murder had shocked the Shaker Heights community, and many people were eager to see justice served. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney James Leakey, 45, was known for his thorough and determined approach to criminal cases. Leakey presented a strong case against Frank McMillan. He argued that Frank had planned Helen's murder with premeditation. Pointing to the evidence of cyanide found in Helen's diet, Pepsi, and Frank's extensive internet searches about the poison, Leakey described Frank's actions as cold and calculated, emphasizing how Frank's obsession with Lisa Levinsky McMillan drove him to commit the crime. On the other side, Frank's defense attorney, Laura Phillips, 38, tried to paint a different picture. Phillips argued that Frank was a man who had been overwhelmed by personal problems and stress, which might have affected his judgment. She claimed that Frank's actions were not premeditated but a result of mental instability. Phillips tried to argue that there was not enough direct evidence linking Frank to the poisoning, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. During the trial, Helen's family, including Lisa, attended each day, visibly emotional and distressed. Lisa was particularly affected by the trial, having to confront the reality of her stepfather's betrayal and her mother's death. The court saw tearful testimonies from friends and colleagues of Helen, who described her as a loving and caring person who would never have imagined such a violent end. After several days of testimony and evidence presentation, the jury deliberated and returned a verdict. On January 22, 2019, Frank McMillan was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced Frank to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was met with a mix of relief and sorrow by Helen's family and friends. They felt that while justice had been served, the pain of losing Helen and the betrayal by Frank would linger. The verdict brought a sense of closure to the case, but it left a lasting impact on those involved. Helen's friends and family had to cope with the aftermath of the trial, trying to rebuild their lives while remembering the warmth and kindness Helen had brought into their lives. The trial was a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind even the most seemingly perfect facets. After Frank McMillan's trial and sentencing, life in Shaker Heights began to return to normal. But the impact of the case was still deeply felt by those involved. The McMillan family was forever changed, and the community was left grappling with the aftermath of the crime. Frank McMillan was transferred to the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, where he began serving his life sentence. His trial had been highly publicized, and he became a known figure in the prison system. His imprisonment was a stark contrast to the life of luxury he had once enjoyed. The media coverage of his case continued for some time, with many local news outlets reporting on his adjustment to prison life and his interactions with other inmates. Lisa Levinsky McMillan, Helen's daughter, faced a challenging RD ahead. She was a pre-med student at the time of her mother's death and had been deeply affected by the murder. After the trial, Lisa took a leave from school to focus on her mental health and process the trauma of the past months. She received support from friends, family, and professional counselors. Her community rallied around her, and many people admired her resilience and strength during such a difficult time. Jessica Miller, Helen's former friend and Frank's secret lover, also had to navigate the consequences of the case. Although she was cleared of any involvement in the murder, the affair and the role she played in Frank's life made her a controversial figure. Jessica's real estate business suffered due to the negative publicity. She decided to move to a different city to start over, hoping to leave the past behind and rebuild her career and personal life. As time went on, Helen's friends and family worked to find a sense of normalcy. They focused on remembering her in positive ways and continuing the community work she had been passionate about. The case served as a harsh reminder of how quickly a life can be upended by betrayal and violence, leaving lasting scars on everyone involved. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like this video for more true crime video. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Take care and see you in the next video.